I am Petra Paredes, and we are downstairs in the kitchen at Petey's Pie Company, and I want to show you a few tricks about making pie crust. One thing that you want to do is make sure that your butter to flour ratio or your fat to flour ratio is pretty high. You want to have about a 2 to 3 ratio by weight. Another problem that people may run into is adding too much liquid and overworking their dough, which activates the gluten and makes it tough. So today I'm going to show you a way that you can use some of your home kitchen tools to make a really good pie crust. So we're going to use a food processor, and this less used part of your food processor, which is the grater. It comes with your food processor, but a lot of people don't know how useful it can be in baking. What we're going to do is we're going to have butter that's been in the freezer for about half an hour, and flour that's been in the freezer for the same amount of time. And we're going to grate the butter in the food processor so that it forms tiny little pieces that are then encapsulated by the flour. Okay, so first step, we have about 2.5 cups of flour here. You're gonna notice that the ratios of the measurements in this recipe are really similar to any butter pie crust recipe that you'll see. We might be a little less on water, but probably the same amount of butter to flour. So it's 2.5 cups of flour. And it's half a pound of butter. So I'm putting a little bit of flour in the bottom of the food processor. And what that's going to do is just going to catch the butter as it comes out in little pieces and make it not stick to the sides. There's a little feeder part in the top of your food processor, and that's what we're going to stick the butter through. You can see it's coming out in tiny little pieces. And if you've ever made pie crust by hand, you know your goal is to make the butter go into small pieces. Looks a lot like grated cheese. But you can do this by having really cold butter and really cold flour and tossing it in using your hands. You can just sort of make little sheets by pressing your forefinger and your thumb together. And this is just a faster way to do that prevents the heat of your hands from activating the gluten. So this is a way of having thin sheets of butter encapsulated by flour, which is your goal in pie crust making. So having everything cold is super important if you're going to do it by hand. The heat of your fingers is going to have some effect, and you want to work quickly and have everything cold to sort of insulate against your body heat. Your goal is to make a flaky crust. When the pie crust is baking, those little sheets, the water in the butter is going to evaporate, and it's going to create steam, and that creates flakes. You still want some little pieces of butter that are not fully incorporated, because that is what's going to make your crust nice and flaky. So one other thing that I do that's a little bit different from how many people are taught to make pie crust by hand is I dissolve the sugar, a tablespoon of sugar and a teaspoon of salt in hot water. So I dissolved it in two tablespoons of hot water. I stirred it till it was completely dissolved, and then I put it in the freezer at the same time as the butter and the flour, so it's in the freezer for about half an hour. The reason I do this is because sugar and salt are both heavier than flour, and they can sink to the bottom of your bowl. So if you're doing this sort of like loose, shaggy butter and flour mixture, you might find that some of your sugar and salt have sunk to the bottom of the bowl. This means that your sugar and salt are going to be incorporated all throughout the dough really equally. So I'm going to just sprinkle that in. So we're just starting with that 2 tablespoons of liquid and just barely working it together until it's a little bit shaggy. Our goal is to not add too much liquid, ultimately. Different people add different liquids, and I like the just plain water method. I think that it really helps the butter flavor shine through. So I'm going to add about 2 more tablespoons. So at this point, you're not trying to make it super consistent. You're trying to just make sure that the water has gone equally throughout the different parts of the dough, but you don't want to overmix or overwork or add so much water that it becomes like a consistent dough. That's not your goal here. So right now what I'm doing is I'm sort of squeezing it together just enough to make it into a consistent or at least a shape that you can ball up. But you'll see that within that shape there are layers And that's your goal. That's going to make a flaky crust for you. The last step for us is just to make little pieces, form a ball with the rest of the dough. So an important thing to look for in the texture here is you don't want it to be super sticky. When you add a lot of water, it becomes super sticky. And I like to just put it into a disc because that's the shape that I'm going to be working with when I start. Next, you can put it in the fridge for about half an hour, and then you can take it out and let it get to closer to room temperature. So you're letting it rest for a little bit. Another thing that you can do is you can freeze this completely. Freezing pie crust is actually a really good thing because it makes the water in the butter form ice crystals. And then when you bake, those ice crystals make the flakes even flakier in your pie crust. So it's nice. You might as well make a couple batches of pie crust while you're at it, and you can have a nice backup pie crust in your freezer that you can take out anytime. Thank you so much for watching. This is an example of our pie crust dough here at Petey's, and I hope you learned something new.